Let's wrap up the Cloak and Dagger with 5 things you need to figure out for your clandestine campaign. Hello there everyone, and welcome back down here to the Gamer's Den with me, your host, Jordan, your Master of Lore and Storyteller Extraordinaire, here to bring about another episode of Cloak and Dagger goodness for you all. Today, we're going to be talking about the 5 things you need to get figured out in order to run this kind of campaign of intrigue for yourself and for your players. And the 5 things involved, they're very broad questions. They can get winnowed down to the specifics, but they're going to really just sort of depend. And those 5 things are: who's involved, what are their goals, what is the context, what is the plan, and what is the counter. Now, that sounds kind of big, but as I said, you can get this winnowed down pretty easily, and as long as you keep asking these questions throughout the course of the campaign, you're going to be able to keep planning right on along, even sometimes freestyling things together for those days where maybe you're not 100% exactly sure, because players being players will sometimes throw that curveball that catches even you off guard. But before we get into any of that, if you're new here to the channel, go on down there, hit the subscribe button, and become a regular member here at the Gamer's Den. Or if you've already gone on ahead and listed yourself on such an incredible roster of legendary heroes, then go on down to hit the like button and share the video far and wide. But now, let's start getting into things here. So, what do any of these 5 questions mean? Remember, those questions are: who's involved, what are their goals, what is the context, what is the plan, and what is the counter. Now, who's involved is simple enough. What are the factions involved? Who's involved in the campaign overall? If we were to go with the example of Skyrim, we have the Stormcloaks, the Empire, and the Thalmor. Those are the 3 principal factions, with all the other factions kind of being in the background of that, or being secondary factions. You know, they can be leveraged, maneuvered, played in the overall larger grand scheme of things, but they're not necessarily the decision makers, the movers and shakers. For example, I posited that it was probably the Thalmor who hired the Dark Brotherhood to go and assassinate the Emperor and his relative. That makes a whole lot of sense, lines up pretty well, and as powerful as the Dark Brotherhood are, they're not really the decision makers. They're the ones carrying out the actions that are ordered, but it's probably the Thalmor ordering them about. So, we know who's involved there, and getting some of the secondary factions figured out too can just add that extra layer of the feel of intrigue, because the players aren't showing up to deal with the bandits, they're showing up to make a deal with the bandits. Don't raid these caravans, raid these specific caravans. Not only do you get to keep the loot, but we'll act as a fence and buy stuff off of you, and not only will we buy stuff off of you, we'll buy it at a 15% markup from what you might normally get. So you can cause all kinds of havoc and mayhem in those instances without having to directly get their hands dirty, and all the bandits are going to know is, that's a lot of gold coming our way. That's going to be absolutely fantastic of a deal for everybody involved, except for the people being raided. But that's just an example of these kind of clandestine maneuvers that you can have your players making, or that you can have your NPCs making against factions involved with the players, or whatever faction the players may be involved with themselves. So, once you know the factions, then you have to know what the factions' goals are. Well, the goals are usually going to be very simple to boil down, but still very big ideas. You know, they want to have dominance over the other factions. They want to wipe out one or more other factions. They want to diminish the powers of other factions. Whatever the case may be, once you get that bigger idea figured out, you can start to figure out the rest. But most important, well, just as important as figuring out what the goals are what's the context, what's the environment, what are the resources involved. Certainly the secondary factions are going to be playing into that, but those get lumped in pretty comfortably into the who's involved portion of things. So once you know what the environment is, what the location is, or locations, then you can really start to plan things out more. For example, the campaign setting that I've been working on out in the elemental wilds, Stone's Folly and everything, where all the different planar factions have come together, struck an accord, and are trying to mine motes of creation, and in particular adamantine ore. Sure, there's other rare ores and minerals that crop up there, rare different kinds of stone and gemstones, even some strange and wild elemental plant life, the flora and fauna that occur there. All definitely very rare resources that any number of factions could make use of. But other than that, those resources, those factions are also looking to compete with one another, gather information from one another, and figure out what is going on there. And in that case, we also know that we're out in the elemental wild. So the elemental plane of Earth, principally, with the elemental planes of fire and air bordering relatively close. So, it's a wild, dangerous, chaotic place with all kinds of shifting hazards. The terrain and the map can shift literally daily in some instances, or even hour to hour, should the players be unfortunate enough to be around at a point where the Earth is literally shifting and reshaping itself, even at this relatively stable point in the elemental plane of Earth. So we know what the hazards are, we know what the resources are that everybody's going after, and we know they're in competition with these other factions, and gathering information is going to be key. And that leads us into what is the plan. You can't plan without information, so information gathering is always going to be number one. So whatever kind of spy work you can do, whatever kinds of social engineering you can do, whatever kinds of scrying magic you can make use of, all of this information gathering is going to be huge. Even better is if you can find somebody to be a turncoat, but that does carry risks in and of itself. Can you fully trust this person that's giving you information? How do you go about vetting it without putting yourself at any greater risk? Because this turncoat could very easily be a double agent, pretending to be a turncoat, giving you bits of good information here and there to gain your trust, but then they start feeding you plausible but bad information alongside the good information. And how long this goes on for just sort of depends on the skill checks that are involved, but potentially a rival faction could be giving the player's faction a lot of bad info through what was thought to be a reliable source. So the players are going to have to get creative with trying to vet a target. Zones of truth, as an example, can be very good, but I do recommend DMs kind of lean a little bit more towards what you see in the books around Drizzt Do'Urden, especially when he was still in the Underdark. Jarlaxle had a way of speaking honestly, but without really necessarily directly answering the question or triggering the zones of truth that were activated around him. So lots of little things like that could play into it there. You have to think very carefully and on your feet, but if something comes out that would be blatantly false, well, then it gets triggered and now the players are wise to what's going on here. So there's a lot of good, clever wordplay that can be coming into this here, and a lot of emphasis on roleplay, which also that puts emphasis on these social skills. In fact, the social skills probably start to reign supreme here, because scrying spells can still be incredibly useful, but the social skills in particular are going to be incredibly valuable to you and your players. So classes like a bard or investigator or even the vigilante, if they've got intimidate or sense motive, they're going to be worth their weight in gold very, very, very often, because gathering this information, making sure it's good, is going to be of paramount importance. And not only that, not only do they want to gather information from any assets, any intelligence assets that might be in place to feed them information, they're going to want to be doing whatever they can to fact check, to verify. So that includes scrying spells. That might include runs into enemy territory, into enemy controlled buildings, where they can gather whatever kinds of paper documentation is available, any ledgers, any scrolls, any maps, anything that might be detailing plans, anything that they can get a look at will help to corroborate that information and make them even more valuable. Allow the players and whatever faction they're involved with to plan more effectively. Now, with that said, when it comes to planning, you also have to plan for the counter, because don't forget, all the other factions are going to be doing the same things. They're going to want to gather information as well. They're going to want to disrupt enemy plans as well. So vetting information is going to be part of the counter. Finding ways of vetting that information is going to be important. Searching your own organization for turncoats, for leaks, for anybody that might be unwittingly even letting information drop and slide. Because if you know that somebody is a leak, but you don't let them know that they are dropping hints and information to their enemies, then you can start giving that leak bad information and start feeding bad information to your enemies that way, until it's entirely too late, or until they realize, oh, the asset's no good anymore, and cut them off. So there's lots of different ways that you can go about this, but that's probably going to be one of the simplest. And again, going back to the elemental wilds as an example here, because we have forces of hell, lawful evil, we have chaotic good forces, we have heaven that are lawful good, we have lawful neutral forces out of Mechanus. These groups are definitely going to be engaging in clandestine activities, but they're not all going to look the same. For example, Mechanus, they would probably chafe quite a bit at the idea of anything underhanded or full of subterfuge that breaks or violates laws. But they're going to recognize the value in it regardless. So they may appoint somebody who is comfortable enough and willing enough to do these kinds of things to put together their own, at least a counterintelligence organization, or at least the counterintelligence arm of their organization, to counteract whatever the other factions might be planning or attempting to do. Any information gathering that they're trying to do on the forces of Mechanus. Now, this character might start to lose their lawful neutral status, maybe going more towards true neutral, but they're still fully dedicated to the plane of Mechanus and making sure that everything is progressing forwards in as safe and secure a manner as possible, while trying to not abuse the sensibilities of their fellow members of this Mechanus faction, this lawful neutral faction. And the forces of lawful good might be in a similar boat. They don't relish the idea of doing this, but they would still be smart enough to recognize the value in trying to protect themselves against these kinds of operations. And sometimes that is going to mean hiring, say, adventurers, people with the moral flexibility necessary to get things done, that maybe by their very nature in some instances, the forces of heaven, of lawful good, cannot necessarily get done themselves. They'll have their own designated hitters, sure. They'll have their own strike teams and the like. If you want to think of it like that, they'll have their own means of doling out pain and punishment, but still having bands of mercenaries to handle these more unsavory clandestine activities is still going to be important. And even that adds another layer of deniability for them, because if the players get caught, they can go, oh no, why would we hire mercenaries and assassins? That's absolutely absurd. We would never do such a thing. These guys are unaffiliated. They're just claiming a bunch of nonsense. So they can be written off, struck from the record, and handed over if need be. Granted, that means lying, and lying is definitely going to be a challenge, except for maybe by their mortal representatives, who will later pray for forgiveness for their sins of deceit and lying. But hey, them's the breaks. And that's just one way of going about all of these things. But you can see where just by having these 5 questions posed and asking them over the course of the adventure over and over again, who's involved? What are their goals? How have their goals changed? What is the context? How has the context changed? What is the plan? How are the plans changing? What is the counter to the plans? What is the counter to the opponent's plans? And how is that changing? Because as the players move and act, and as they undo the schemes and unravel the conspiracies of rival factions, these other factions are going to be moving to counter them. They're going to be moving to try to do whatever they can to dissuade, to sway, to change the minds of the players in any which way that they can, and everything is going to be fair game. So if their characters have family members that they care about, those are now leverage, those are now targets. If they have any resources that they typically draw on, well, those are now leverage and also targets, and a means of squeezing the players, as we had talked about in previous episodes. So there's just so many different things that you can do, and just bear in mind, like I said before, this is a type of setting where if you're focusing more on these kinds of clandestine activities, you're still going to have research, you're still going to have knowledge checks, but social checks are going to be of greater importance overall. And then combat encounters are still going to be present. They're just not going to necessarily be as emphasized. So blasting spells, again, going to take just a tiny bit of a backseat compared to charm spells, illusions, scrying magics. But by no means are those things useless. I mean, being able to disintegrate a target that's bearing down on you, going to be incredibly valuable. Or doing that to support beam and causing a roof to collapse, or deal incredible damage to a structure that's of vital importance to an opponent faction, is going to still be very useful. But the ability to think, plan, gather information, and conduct other forms of research are going to be very, very apparent for this kind of game, and can present unique and interesting challenges for yourself and for your players. And these are still questions that are going to be applicable across all kinds of campaign settings, not just the clandestine spy versus spy kind of campaigns. All sorts of regular adventures or war campaigns or any kind of other campaigns you could really think of are going to be benefiting from developing your ability to answer these 5 questions overall. But what do you think? Go on down to the comments below and let me know your thoughts. Did you like today's video? Did you dislike it? Let me know either way by hitting those like or dislike buttons and leaving your thoughts in the comments down below so that we can engage in discussion. And remember, if you've made it this far, you must have enjoyed something, so why not go down there, hit the subscribe button, and become a regular member here at the Gamers Den. But with all that said, I've been your host, Jordan, your master of lore and storyteller extraordinaire. Thank you all so very much for your time. Good gaming to you all, and you all have yourselves a good night.